Hi, I'm Melissa, and this is The Book Break. And today we have a special treat. We are talking to New York Times bestselling author Maureen Johnson, and she has a really cool new book out talking about Cruella de Vil, but as a teenager. Let's bring her on in.
Hi there. How are you?
Hi, Maureen. I'm great. So I just finished reading your book, and I thought it was a really fun YA book. But, obviously I'm an adult, and I still loved it. How about you give us a synopsis of your book?
Well, we start in London in 1967. And this is the story of Estella. That was Cruella's name because nobody's born with the name Cruella. And she is about 16 years old. She lives with her friends Jasper and Horace. And they live in a bombed out wreck of a building that was torn apart during the war that they have converted into a lair. And they survive on pickpocketing, stealing, basically just to survive. But Estella knows that she is a genius. She is a fashion designer. She is amazing at making clothes. No one is better. And she steals cloth. She steals buttons. She steals everything she can to make her creations. And she wants the world to know that she is a great designer. But how do you do that when you're an orphan and you're broke and you live in a bombed out building with your friends and you steal wallets to survive? And that's where we really begin. And Estella one day gets picked up and sort of adopted as a project by a brother and a sister named Magda and Richard, who are in with London society. And this is really where our story begins.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about when she met Magda and Richard was that seemed to be one of the few times she was completely honest with who she was and what she did. And I thought, wow, she was pretty bold when they said, "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to steal fabric." Yeah, I loved that. And I think one of my favorite parts in that beginning when she was meeting them was she told them she was a designer, and then they looked at her outfit and kind of went, So she ran in an alley, made a dress out of newspapers.
And the reason I wanted to do this book is because of it really not Cruella, but when it takes place. Because I have had a lifelong true obsession, genuinely, that is the correct word, with London in the late 60s, early 70s, because of everything that was going on. This started when I was about 13 years old, and it really started with music, but it evolved into kind of everything. And that paper dress she makes is sort of accurate for the time. There were paper dresses. You could buy them in a bag and unfold them and put them on, because one of the many things that's exciting about 1967 in London is everything that was going. It's hard to overstate how colorful and strange and weird and experimental everything was. So There were paper dresses. There were dresses made of metal and plastic and feathers and shiny bits and antiques. If you could imagine it, they had clothes made of it.
Yeah. And I thought that cover that we just showed, I love your cover too, because it's really colorful, and it shows kind of her background with having all these different unique things underneath her. So I thought that was really cool. And one of the things that I loved about this was we saw Cruella in a human experience. And I never thought of her as anything more than a villain before. Right. But this was kind of fun to see how she went from being a 16-year-old kid just wanting to be a fashion genius to Cruella. So will you tell us a little bit more about that transition?
Well, a lot of people, when they ask me about this, they say, "Oh, the Disney Cruella de Vil." And I'm this person that's like, no, Cruella de Vil was created by Dodie Smith, who is an amazing writer. It was Dodie Smith who wrote 101 Dalmatians. But Dodie Smith also wrote a book called I Capture the Castle, which I think is one of the greatest YA books ever written. And it was written in the 1950s. I believe the early 50s, but I could be wrong on that. And it's one of the most human and funny and nuanced portraits of being a teenager that I've ever read. And that's really what I wanted to think about, is that, it's not just a cartoon, but a character created by someone who wrote incredibly nuanced characters, the teenage characters. everybody's got to come from somewhere. So when you roll the clock back, because the film Cruella takes place in the mid 70s, so that's sort of a punk era. When you roll it back to when she's 16, when you take into account the time, her circumstances, and what has to happen inside of you, because Cruella is really the voice inside of her that says, you can't. What? No one actually likes you. Why would you think you can do this? You're going to fail. Everyone really hates you. They're just lying to you. It's that negative voice that turns her into a villain.
Yeah, I love that too, especially in a YA novel, because I mean, even as adults, we all still kind of have that negative voice.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I think that even for teenagers, that might be even more prevalent than for adults. And how can we combat that? I think that's really important to see that our thoughts can turn into who we become.
I think that our thoughts always turn us in, that it's, if we think it, we become it. And we can do that accidentally, or we can do it on purpose, but that's always what happens. And of course, we're influenced by outside factors, but it's how we react to the outside factors. So she has this voice inside of her that's always trying to protect her. Because I think all of our internal voices are trying to protect us, but they do it sometimes through very, very negative, distorted ways. So we're starting to see the psychological process that turns someone into who we eventually see, Cruella de Vil.
Yeah. I thought that was such a fascinating thing to talk about as kind of a back thing, to have this overarching theme that your thoughts become who you are. So yeah. I really like that a lot. So tell me a little bit more about your process in writing this book, because you mentioned how you're a huge fan of England in that time frame. I personally, I meant to go to England in 2020. We had a trip planned, and then 2020 happened and we were not able to go. So I would love to hear from you some of your research that you did, because it's clear in the book you knew that area, or you know that area.
Oh, I do. Yeah, I do. First of all, I've been doing the research on this book accidentally since I was about 13. Truly, I didn't even need to look a lot of this up. And a lot of the little details in the book are accurate. So unnecessarily so, but if you look, they're going to be accurate. The street that she lives on, I put them on a street called Cheyne Walk, which is a very, very fancy street that runs along the Thames. And their real neighbors would have been Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull and Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg. And I put David Bowie's house around the corner, but nobody really knows that. It's just for me. All the boutiques are real. The club names are real. I just knew. And I got some of it I had to look back up, but most of it I just knew. I've spent a lot of time in England. My husband is English. And I'm also very map obsessed when I write. I have to know where in space things happen. So if it's completely fictional, I usually draw the maps and have them created. And if it's based on, and I always have real life landscaping maps, and sometimes I buy historical maps so I can see. It's just the way my brain works.
Yeah, I can tell definitely by reading the book that you really know that area. And I really like that a lot. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I read this that I thought you did a really great job with was getting into the mind frame. Like when Estella first went out to eat with Magda and Richard, the thought that she was starving and wanted to dive in and eat her food. And they were just, looking around and not even thinking about that. And the mindset of somebody that's really hungry, and how we think differently, but we can change that. Anyways, I'm wondering,
she's really genuinely hungry. They don't have a lot to eat. And when you kind of think again about the time, they're not going to really have a refrigerator. They have a little tiny thing that they've stolen that doesn't really work. There's also, up until right before this story takes place, there was a limited supply of certain foods. Mm-hmm. Like there was literally ration, there were ration books that went through the 50s. So a lot of people kind of grew up slightly underfed, or they just didn't have a lot of choice. Mm-hmm. So the fact that really that there were suddenly all of these would have seemed like super exotic foods, like an avocado or green tea, or like they're like, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, we have never seen these things before. I like presenting people with things like that, and having them to have to negotiate new food is, I think, always a fun thing.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's great too. Well, thank you so much for being here with us. We've shown some of the places for your social media and things like that, but can you tell us just real quick a couple places that we can find you and learn more about you, about this book and your other books?
You can find me on Instagram at Maureen Johnson Books. I'm always on Twitter at Maureen Johnson, and my site is maureenjohnsonbooks.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Maureen.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on the book break. We'll see you next time.